Hello and welcome back to part 6 in this series of videos of helping you set up your Synology NAS right the very first time in 2024 and onwards. Now, this is part 6 in this series, and right now, although I've only just finished editing down part 5, I will say right now, at least at the time of recording, that there's probably a very good chance that I should have made this part of this series across each of the brands sooner rather than later. So again, I apologise we've got to part 6 before we do this, but I will say straight away that this is such a big subject and it is so full of variables for every different kind of user that we've had to break this down into its own two-part series. Part 6 is going to be about securing access to your Synology NAS locally. It's going to be talking about access security, adding safeguards, adding provisos, adding little kind of triggers and warnings into the system to ensure that either your system adaptively and automatically pulls down the shutters when it needs to, or that it doesn't even need to in the first place. However, if you are coming to this video for information on setting up your dynamic DNS, or you're looking at your certification, firewall configuration, VPN installation there, or enabling and configuring DOS, denial of service attacks, that's going to be in part 7. As in order to make this more legible and easier to follow, I'm moving all services that I deem external security provisions into a separate part. So again, DDNS, using certificates and why, firewalls, DDoS protection and VPN levels of protection and configuration are going to be in part 7. But let's start. Securing your Synology NAS is hugely important, whether it is you're going to be connecting it to the internet or not. If you are someone that's only just got hold of a NAS, you may not be aware that Synology actually has an ongoing security vulnerability database, updated regularly on their security advisory about ongoing security concerns. This shouldn't come as a big surprise, and you shouldn't be too scared, because most software we use these days with any even light level of internet access and a GUI configuration ultimately will open the door to vulnerabilities, open the door to security and attack vectors that you need to think about and manage. Indeed, probably one of the biggest examples that hit Synology was way back in 2013-14, known as Synology. It was detailed in numerous places online, to a point where not only did Synology outline it and of course resolve it at the time, they went through quite a number of years of basically this being referenced alongside their brand, and they learned a lot from this. And fast forward now to 2024, even though they've got that security advisory, in the majority of cases, the vulnerabilities that have been found are inherent to Linux or are inherent to very, very specific user case scenarios. And even then, some of them are malpractice or, at the very least, poor configuration by end users, which can lead to this particular vulnerability. Now, there's going to be a lot of stuff in this video that we're going to cover, but I would straight away reckon right out the gate that if you haven't already got it installed, go into the package center and look for the security advisor. If you don't find it on there, that almost certainly means, as per DSM recent updates, that you've already got it. The security advisor will allow you to scan your network attached storage system and at least get a base level of things that could amend and require changing, many of which we're going to cover today. And luckily, Synology have actually included both a home and personal use versus business use setup. And needless to say, that when it comes to the business use, things are going to be a little bit more integral. So we're just going to go ahead and run the business class one here, just because at least with that one, we're going to be looking at stuff like auto blocking and IP filtering. But go ahead and click that start, and right now it will scan there in the background, and we're going to be coming back to that later on, because later on as we go through this, many of the changes and the implementations that I'm going to recommend are going to be in that security advisor. But I would reckon straight away the majority of users, and a lot of this is going to feel obvious, but you might just not know that it's available on the Synology platform. Go into the control panel and head into your user groups. Now in your user groups, when you've got a bunch of users there, it's really important that you check, and again by default it will be disabled. Make sure that admin user is disabled, because in the majority of cases when a vulnerability can be exploited, it needs power. It needs the ability to control, manage and push through any kind of system pushback in order to exploit an attack vector. So with that in mind, the admin account has now been disabled by default, but some users will enable it. And one of the reasons they might enable things like that is because they might be wanting to use something called SSH. Now, SSH is traditionally used for back-end access to the system or using command line access. And again, the majority of attack vectors, and again, if you head over to Synology's own database here, you will almost, in practically every single case, find that the vulnerability is at command line level. It is injecting a line of code. That is why ransomware has become so prevalent compared with the likes of malware or viruses. Viruses and malware, they tend to either try to corrupt or destroy the system in the majority of cases. Ransomware is a great deal more simple and unfortunately a lot more threatening, because what it does is it will inject a line of code into an opening in the vulnerability, opening in the system posed by vulnerability, and then inject a line of code that says zip up all of the data in there. Stick it all in a .rar, a .zip, a .whatever, but a very specific kind of zipped up file there. And then toss away the key, give it a key, and delete the key and keep it out of the records. The command line will tell the system. You come back to the system, all of your data is locked up, you can't unlock it, but the attackers have left a little ransom note in a little Word doc type file, an RTF. You open it up and it says, send us money to this link online. We want our money back. In most cases, having SSH enabled widens that door. The same with the admin account. So by ensuring that SSH is disabled and ensuring your admin account is disabled, you've already removed a decent chunk of capability of any exploited vulnerability there. So next up, we'll continue down the road of the bleeding obvious. Next, we'll talk about updates. This is something, and I've touched on it in other videos, that all too often causes confliction and is actually where a lot of exploited vulnerability, blood on the hands, lies with end users. What do I mean by that? Well, you've got a Windows machine, you've got a Mac machine, you've got an Android or an iOS device. Chances are, much like me on the bottom of the screen, and I'm hoping you can make it out there if I move my little camera up, down here, there's a little blue dot here, just letting me know there's an update. Now in the case of this update, it's telling me, do you want Windows 11? I do not want Windows 11. But all too often, we will be using a system, we turn it on, we've got work to do, and then the system goes, there's an update, do you want to do it now? And you say no, because it's really annoying, isn't it? Because you come to the laptop, the PC, whatever, to do your job. It's understandable, I get it. But your PC, phone, whatever, your usage of it is not genuinely 24/7. It sits in your pocket or with the lid closed. In the case of a NAS, all too often, these are on 24/7, and therefore, an exploited vulnerability or an announced vulnerability that has been found either in the core Linux platform or in one of Synology's apps or services themselves needs to be sewn up very, very quickly. All too often, whether it is a vulnerability like the ones that Pwn2Own, one that Synology actually engage with white hat hackers to find vulnerabilities and pay them, the same with their bounty program, these vulnerabilities, once they are found and then Synology close the door on them, it's up to you to install that update. That's why by default, the majority of users are recommended to ensure that automatic updates are enabled. Now, again, you can choose to just hear about the updates via the email notifications or the system notifications there, or you can choose on a case-by-case basis whether you want to install them, or you can choose, as mentioned there, that security and critical updates go through, but not the middle of the road ones. Personally, I would always install the latest update there, because some of these security vulnerabilities here are very, very small and are related to things that you may or may not be using or may not even know you are using when they are back-end file service vulnerabilities that have been found. The second thing that a lot of users tend to skip over is in the App Center. They'll do automatic updates for the system, but they won't think to install updates on the apps. Automatic updates on apps is just as important. Go back to that list of vulnerabilities there, and did you notice how many of them say DSM and SRM? Fine, that's the main operating system. But look how many of these relate to specific applications, result to specific services. You need to make sure when it comes to finding vulnerabilities on your system that the ones that are related specifically to apps and services are also closed. because it's one thing to have the system running 24/7, but some of these apps, and I include first and third party here, have default gateways, have default settings there, and that is where those exploitations can happen. These are not hard-coded vulnerabilities in the traditional sense, but they are at the very least duplicated layouts. Again, authentication keys and credentials are not duplicated, but the layouts and the openings of these apps are, and therefore vulnerabilities can be towed just that little bit further forward if you do not install the updates to close the vulnerabilities that Synology find on these apps. And another big way to shut down and minimize further and further the opening for attack vectors that when they are found in these apps is to ensure that your system is as unique as possible. And one of the easiest by a country mile is to change the default ports. When you set the system up, the Synology NAS, to make things as easy as possible, has a tendency to use default network ports. It's either 8000 or 8001 if you're going to be utilizing the encryption, certification, something we'll talk about into part 7. But in the case of Synology, they go with the port 5000 or 5001 by default. So you're already thinking, well, that's different to everyone else. Surely that's going to lower the attack vector. Well, this isn't exactly hard to know, and it's well publicized online. So regardless of that difference, it's strongly recommended to go down to the login portal section there at the bottom left, then go into the web services here, and then from here change that port, change it to something else. Now I'm not going to be changing it for this video because, as mentioned earlier on, we've still got lots to do and I've already binded a lot of those ports for this setup. But for you, I strongly recommend changing that number, and particularly if you're going to go and utilize a script. And again, we'll cover this more in part 7, but again, you can look into that early doors if you want by going into the security tab. I would recommend changing that number, and the same goes with applications, as you can go ahead and change a number of these as well, just going in easily and changing some of those default details there. But again, once you go down that road, it can get messy. Just make sure that at least the key DSM ports for both HTTP and HTTPS with encryption, and that's encrypted certificate, are changed by default. Onto another arguably well-trodden and well-understood security barrier you can put in place to even further delete and remove attack vectors, but still nonetheless we should drill into a little bit more detail, is of course two-step authentication. If you're already logged into the device, you can go into the personal settings, and then from there go into the security tab, and you can add two-step authentication either with Synology's own sign-in application for iOS or Android, or utilizing already established OTP or TFA two-step authentication services like Google's Google Authenticator there, which again I strongly recommend. I use it all the time. You put in the password of the system you want to use, and then from there, after the password, scan it and use Google Authenticator. It's a completely free application. You scan the 3D barcode, and that means that when you're logging into the NAS, you have to put in your username, your password, but then you also have to put in a refreshing every 30 to 60 seconds code to get into that system. It's a very useful endeavor and something that's been established all the way over the internet. You can even go for passwordless login using Synology's own secure sign-in app to ensure that access to the system is actually bound to a specific user and their specific mobile device. Again, lowering it considerably. But what if there's multiple users accessing the system? What if you've got a whole team of users? We mentioned it earlier on that you might be having users and groups, all of which bound together. You might have your security information in your own two-step authentication absolutely on point, 10 out of 10. But what about those bozos? What are they doing? Well, when you go into a lot of these users' accounts here, there's actually stuff you can do to change their default logins with regards to their passwords and two-factor authentication there. Now, you could change individual users. So, for example, this Plex account that we created in a previous video to ensure that Plex Media Server access was limited to a specific account ID, you can go in and actually set up some of the permissions by default. And again, we've covered this in parts 2 and 3 of this video series, where you ensured that users could only access certain storage areas, certain applications to a certain degree, and only have read or write only access. And you can even go ahead and change, if you choose, to not only ensure that their password access is limited, or that they have to use certain kinds of passwords and protected characters and stuff like that, but I would strongly recommend, if you've got more than about 3 to 4 users, don't just rely on those user account create password details, start filtering them into groups, because the groups have better overarching enforced rules for their security. So for example, if we go for a new group here, and we're going to call this group secure, so secure 1, and that secure group 1, we're going to call these low access users. So from here we can add some of our users. We're going to dump Alan and the guest account in there. We can say that this user has got no access to anything. We don't want them to have access to anything at all, apart from, say, one folder where we're going to let them have read and write access to photos, to upload photos, and perhaps multimedia. So from there, with that user, we can then assign them a storage quota if we choose, and then from there we can say which apps that they can use as well. So say we only want them to be able to use backup, so we can go and give them hyper backup access if we choose, or we can go ahead and give them cloud synchronization access. Again, we can limit it to those individual users there. Once we've created that group, we can take things one step further, because by moving people into those groups in the password tab here, we can really set the rules hard on a group level in a way that individual user password and security credential information is nowhere near as elaborate. We can change the strength rules as mentioned. We can really break down some of the specifics of the passwords. We can then do password expiry, which means they're going to have to renew that password periodically just in case, you know, that password becomes compromised. And along with that, we can change so much in terms of what they can access, how and when. And again, all of this manageable and enforceable from a super user account. And again, you don't have to be an admin to do this. So if you're going to have more than 3 to 4 users, yes, give them tight security credentials each, but at the same time, pop them into groups for a better overarching control, and once again, reduce the attack vector even further. And if you want to enforce two-step authentication and take it even further, once again, group authentication by going into the control panel tab, go into security, and then into account will allow you to force two-step authentication onto those users or groups. And again, I do recommend going for enforced two-factor authentication with the groups, not just the user, because that means if people get moved around, it doesn't all of a sudden undo a potential security barrier without you knowing. Now, all of the work we've done thus far are about putting up walls, putting up fences, putting up barriers between potential attackers and your system and, of course, your data. I've already mentioned several times that when it comes to remote access stuff involving the internet, we're going to be moving that in part 7 to show you just how you're going to set up those particular safeguards. However, we do need to talk about what if a system in the network, such as a laptop, a phone or whatever, becomes compromised. What about if they are behind that external wall protected by firewalls and remote access port forwarding rules and restrictions? What if a system inside your network becomes compromised? And that is where we have to head back into the security tab on the control panel here and start allowing auto blocking behind. And of course, a lot of the steps we're going to do right now also affect externally, but getting them in place also benefits you internally. Now, one of the earliest things when you're going through the security tabs, and this option will be unticked by default, is to do with compatibility, IP checks being done for incompatible web browsers. So if you move to a new web browser, all too often that can actually limit access to DSM. And what you often find with a lot of attack vectors is they're not going through the traditional web browser means. Even if they've managed to clone an authentication token inside your web browser, which is again what I recommend going to over to Lawrence Systems, watch Tom's video on just how that happened when Linus Tech Tips security to their YouTube channel was compromised to do with the duplication of authentication tokens and cloning. A lot of that is not done with traditional web browsers in the way that you know, Mr. Right, with virtual web browsers and of course already compromised web browsers that can run in very unique manners there and with sophisticated repeated attacks there. So although this is unticked by default, I would still recommend ensuring the security level of DSM is in place to ensure that only the web browsers you trust and you already use are available. So I would not skip IP checking there. I would make sure that remains unchecked. It's not worth it just to allow some third-party non-known web browser, perhaps via a virtual machine or maybe a Linux platform, to garner access there. The majority of these other options, by the way, don't really need to be played with, but the login settings are the ones that you want to play with there. Because as you can see there, an automatic timeout for applications may be useful to you. Because let's face it, when you're using an app or service, it may be transferring data, time may pass. And how long you want that session to remain open, particularly with client tools in the distance on other people's users, is something you're going to want to look into to narrow the attack window. It's one thing to find the vector, the crack in the window, how long a window remains unlocked for. You want an auto lock to slam down, and this is the first step along that road, which is where we get into auto blocking and auto locking on the system. Down from that two-factor authentication and using multi-factor authentication there, we can talk a lot more about account protection. It is strongly advised that you enable this. Now, this applies to both known and unknown devices. This is how you work out if a system is trying to brute force hack your Synology NAS by using different variable passwords. You can have a certain number of login attempts, and then you can have a cooldown period that stops users accessing it. Now, and again, you can change certain accounts preferences and access in there if you choose, but it is still recommended to lower this number, I would say, to 2 to 3 attempts. Again, maybe you forgot your password, maybe you forgot that little caps lock there, you're using an unfamiliar password, I get it, but still nonetheless, I would definitely raise that cooldown period and lower those login attempts there. The same goes for trusted clients as well, because you may give a little bit of elasticity to trusted clients, staff members, family members, and again, within the local area network or not. But remember, your system is only as secure as every other device it's connected to and the pathways they have. So you can ensure that both those numbers are respectively low for known and unknown devices as well. Now, this gets taken up to 11 if you enable adapted multi-factor authentication. Now, you might be utilizing your Synology NAS all the time between a handful of devices. You might be using a mobile phone and a desktop. But what if you've bought a new phone? What if you have to format that PC? What if you've moved from Windows 10 to 11 and it's changed enough about your system, or you're simply using incognito, that you're trying to access the system and you might not be the same person. Now, adaptive multi-factor authentication, what this does is it will see that you use the correct login information, but it will see enough change that it will require a secondary authentication. Now, this can extend to utilizing a password if you were using passwordless login. It can also extend to an email verification. It can also extend to using the Synology sign-in app or even DS Finder. Ultimately, this allows the system to have a secondary authentication method if things just seem just a little bit off. Now, again, all of these measures we've talked about thus far are about not only lowering that attack vector, but also adding thicker glass to the window, another lock on the door. If you go with all of these, just bear in mind that the system may appear to you overzealous sometimes, but just know that all this is doing is lowering all of those horrible attack vectors. And when it comes to knowing about if you're being attacked, one of the earliest things you should be doing is not only monitoring the logs via the log center, which tells you all of the access that has happened over time to your system, but also, as long as you go with notifications to get a lot of that information, but also within the settings menu, enable notifications to come through when erroneous attack attempts are being made, and semi-automated rules and options to kick in, you're able to create a nice integrated automated system that will let you know if bad things are happening. But to go into that automated system and setting those rules, heading back into the control panel there, it is also advised within the security tab to enable further protection with auto block there at an IP level, because all of the previous blocks that we were talking about in the previous section were about login protection there and re-authenticating those individual users and their credentials, but their physical devices all have to exist on an IP, be it external or internal. And what you can do if you're worried about that, in conjunction with systems as they come in is to auto block certain IPs, or at the very least, once an IP comes through that is not trusted, block for a certain period of time to allow you the means to investigate the IP or the device on that IP that's trying to come in and allow them or fully deny access. So as you can see, this IP block here after 10 failed attempts right now will block that IP. So it means even if that system opens up another web browser, it doesn't matter. As long as that device is still remaining on the same IP identity, that IP now is deemed suspicious. So with that, not only can you have it so that that IP is immediately blocked and automatically, or blocked for at least a certain period of time until you investigate, but you can actually create actively created block lists there that can go down to a local or an external IP, even a range of IPs for devices, so you can ensure that the auto block comes into effect, or at least allows, say for example on a VLAN, these IPs, which are a virtual LAN I should say, so this is a LAN, a local area network that lives within your existing local area network, and this little bunch of virtual network identities here, you can have all of your staff here and ensure that those devices are allowed within the local area network. But if they're not within that little clutch of IPs there on that VLAN and all the other ones is trying to get in, you can ensure that those other ones are on the blocked IP list. So a block list there, we could create all the identities of the IP, say for example, all of the IPs from say 192.168.1, everything from 10 and above, block those, and everything from 1 up to 9, they are allowed into the system there. You can really curate the level of access into your system. And again, we could talk a little bit more about denial of service attacks, which again can come through on the local area network via a compromised device inside your network, but I'm going to leave more on that when we talk in part 7 about remote access protection. And finally, before we go back to that security advisor from earlier on, it's worth also talking a little bit about file services here, because the majority of basic Synology users are going to be using SMB. If you're a Mac user, you're almost certainly going to be erring more towards AFP and stuff like that. And the majority of these are disabled by default. Rsync I've enabled because I'm doing a NAS to NAS backup, but by default, the majority of these are going to be disabled. Now, for the majority of users, I recommend you keep it that way. SMB is too useful, I think, for local borderline basic level access to your local area network, and I think a lot of the security protections and automated provisos that we talked about thus far will be enough to cover SMB going in. But for the majority of other services, if you're not using them, turn them off, as these are just opening up potential attack vectors where some of these might be using hard-coded port numbers, which again you do find out with rsync and real-time remote replication that a lot of the time they are using the same port and identifying access points overall. So disable them if you're not using them. And if ever you're in any doubt about what access applications, individual users or groups have, and you want to see the whole thing in an overarching overview, head back into the control panel, head to the bottom where you see application privileges, and you can actually, utilizing the permission viewer, see just what level of access to different applications and services there is available and afforded to individual services and users. And the same goes, that it breaks all the way down, hadn't noticed this before, to IP addresses as well, which is pretty darn cool to know just what level of access some services have there. And again, you can't amend them there, but you can amend some level of access in this access here. But if, for example, you want to know for certain whether you've just got a new user, whether they are going to be able to access something they should or shouldn't have, this permission viewer will really help that. So going back into earlier on, that security advisor we ran at the start of the video, we can see that this system is pretty much at quite a decent amount of risk. Let's bring it down there to the bottom. No malware has been found, and if you wish, you can go into the package center, by the way, and install antivirus software from 2 different services. There's the one that's included with your Synology NAS, and again, what this is going to do is scan the files in the system for any kind of issues of, problematic .exes or executionals that could harm your system. But all too often you'll find that a lot of these have to be tailored to the Synology system in order to exploit the system. So as useful as this is, and I do still recommend you using it, and again, setting up a schedule using the antivirus software is always handy, and you can create that to happen at 1 AM if need be. It's still more a case of if that issue has got into your system, someone would have had to manually upload a problematic file into your system, and then you'd have to allow the antivirus to scan it. It would still need to be a compromised Synology compatible file, but still never hurts to have this running at some time in the morning and then have files automatically moved into quarantine as and when they are found. And going further into what the security advisor found, as you can see, domain server signing is disabled. We aren't allowing external access to this system yet, but if we were, it would be incredibly important to have that in place. The same goes with redirection to HTTPS rather than HTTP for non-encrypted and non-certified access. You can see the padlock there, or the non-secure element here at the top left, because we're going with LAN access here. We're not going to be too concerned about that, but maybe we should. And if you are a business user, maybe have that in place. You can see the default access points for a 5000 and 5001 have not been amended, just like we saw earlier on. And password strength has not met the needs, or at least the default standard considered for business. Recognizable words, unknown characters there, introducing a letter, alphanumeric characters and mixing in between. Again, this is pretty darn useful, and all of that will allow you to stay on top of the good and bad of your system. And this will cover the majority of stuff that we've talked about. And just like antivirus, this can be run on a schedule. Moreover than that, if some things are more important to you, you can't really be pigeonholed into the home versus business user. And maybe you're a solo worker, someone that works on your own stuff. You work from home, you run your own one-man business. From that, you can run custom rules, which are far, far more applicable to your needs. You can change the variables, change the benchmarks for security on your system to be better suited to your own individual setup. There is a lot of customization there. And remember, just like I mentioned earlier on with AutoBlock, you know that you may have this gut instinct to just turn every single security barrier on to ensure you've got 100% or 99.9% security barriers up there, but that will impinge your day-to-day access. And a lot of these variables are about finding the line between access and convenience versus true security, and there'll never be a 100% for either of those without just pulling the Ethernet cable out the back of your NAS. But this has been security on your Synology NAS and getting it right first time. Part 7 should be with us in the next week or so as I'm editing through all of these videos, and I'll say that one is far more tailored towards external access. So if you are going to be utilizing Synology Quick Connect, if you're going to be assigning a domain to this system, if you are going to be, God forbid, opening up ports for direct access externally to your system, maybe check out that video. But thank you so much for watching. Again, as mentioned in the other videos, there's our free advice section, there's our NAS builder tool there for you to understand exactly which NAS best suits your needs. You can utilize our community forum at ask.nascompares. Contact us on Ko-Fi or Patreon, join our membership tiers there, get expedited support if the free advice section isn't quite quick enough for you, 3 to 5 working days, or one of the many third and first party forums and support platforms that we recommend there. But apart from that, I will see you next time.